Hello everybody and welcome to another video, and today is the 2nd of October, and there are three specific parts of the front line that I will talk about today. And there's a lot of news that unfolded over the past 24 hours, so I will be getting into all of that. So first of all, in the Kherson region, we actually did see a Ukrainian breakthrough which achieved some significant gains today. So it started out a few days ago with some initial reports of Ukraine starting to reinforce their positions around Osokorivka over here. And then a few hours ago, they actually began their assault and actually ended up capturing the town Zolotobalka. And the reason why this is so important is because they've been trying to actually assault Zolotobalka for a while. At the beginning of their Kherson counteroffensive about a month ago, they were able to enter towns such as Lyubiumivka and Petrivka, but they never actually reached Zolotobalka. And part of that is because, one, it's farther away than those two towns. It's about 3 miles away from the front line, and it's a pretty high elevation area, so it is difficult to capture. But now they've actually been able to break through, and I would say part of this is because the Russians did move out some of their forces to deal with the collapse of the front line around Kharkiv. So now there weren't that many VDV paratroopers in this area to hold the line. Those that are present, they were not able to hold the line and they were forced to retreat further south. So you did have Ukraine take over Zolotobalka. So now they do have the high ground in this area, and they very quickly advanced first towards Kreminna, and there's a geolocation over here. And then they just advanced further south, taking several towns such as Lyubiumivka, which was previously contested, but then Russia actually took it back, and the front line was like this as of yesterday. Obviously, now that's changed. So the Ukrainians also took Petrivka and Shevchenkivka, Ukrainka, Leninske, Mikhailivka, Novu Alexandrivka, and most importantly, as of now, Havrilivka, because this is the one town that's very close to Duchany, which is basically the goal of this Ukrainian assault at the moment. You have some very heavy fighting going on right next to Duchany, and Havrilivka is just 5 miles away from the town, but by now the fighting has really reached the outskirts. You have fighting reported in the forested areas just north of the town, and this is an important town in terms of supplies. You did have a lot of ferries that were stationed in this area that were sending supplies to and from each side of Kherson. And so the fall of this town would be a big loss to the Russian grouping in Kherson. And what's being said is that the long-term goal is really to reach Berislav over here, this town. And this town is pretty close to Novakakovka. So if the Ukrainians were able to reach Berislav, they would actually be able to cause a total collapse in the front lines. You could see a lot of the Russian groupings that have been holding out for the past month actually get routed, and they'd have to retreat from the west part of the Kherson region, abandon everything west of the Dnieper River. It would be a major defeat. So as of now, it seems as if the situation sort of stabilized as of the past few hours, but this is only temporary as Ukraine continues to send in reinforcements to this new area that they've just taken. And they really have advanced, say, 25 kilometers in a single day, which is pretty crazy, about 16 miles. So that's a lot given the static nature of this war. And that really is just because this area was so undefended and this area was so undermanned. So Ukraine really did have a good opportunity here to break through. And I am pretty sure that they used the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade to take Zolotobalka. I had previously talked about how it was stupid to send them to the bridgehead over here around Andriivka, and that they should be fighting around Zolotobalka. So maybe the General Staff of Ukraine heard my commentary and they moved them to the northern part of the front line. And now they're operating in this area and they're fighting around the heights. And in terms of what could happen next, we did receive news that the 129th Territorial Defense Brigade took over Arkhangelsk. So you can see some sort of combined assault from actually not just two but three directions. One from this bridgehead over here around Andrivka, one from the Duchany, this breakthrough near Duchany, and then one from Arhangelsk. So it would look something like this. First they take over Duchany, then they sort of like approach Milove, and then they take control of this road, and they'd eventually have to just link up with the bridgehead. In order for this to happen, they have to take over Davydiv Brid, and then yeah, you basically link up with the two Ukrainian assaults, and then you could have the supplementary attack by the 129th, the Territorial Defense Brigade, over here, and they would be able to encircle a large amount of Russian forces that are centered around the front line in Olkhine, Vysokopilia, that entire area. So let's look deeper into what's going on over there, because now that the Ukrainians have actually finally taken over this area, they are very close to Blaktine, and Blaktine, it is a supply hub. You do have a junction here for transport, so that is going to be under Ukrainian assault tomorrow and over the next few days. Also, Novopetrivka is in a very peculiar position, especially Olkhine, because it is now being attacked from three directions, so you might see the Russians withdraw from here before they can get encircled, and then the new line would be around Vermivka. But again, there are not many Russian defenses in this area. I will say though that Kherson itself, the entire region, is pretty well defended, at least compared to some of the other parts of the front line, but these defenses are the worst in the northern part of Kherson. Most of the Russian defenses that they set up are actually just around the city itself and on its outskirts, like Kiselivka or some of the towns around the Inhulets River. Also, Berislav is pretty well defended, but all of these areas that are along the front line, they weren't that well defended, and whatever haphazard defenses are set up now by the paratroopers and the VDV might not be sufficient to prevent a major breakthrough. In terms of the Ukrainian units that are operating in this renewed counteroffensive, the ones in the north that I have been able to keep track of are first the 1st Tank Brigade, which is operating now in Lyubimivka. So that's pretty interesting. You have some tank units in here, and also probably the 5th Tank Brigade is also operating in this part of northern Kherson, because I did see that they were headquartered in Kryvyi Rih, so they were most likely sent to the front line very recently to help with the breakthrough. And then in terms of some non-tank units, you have the 60th Infantry Brigade, which was operating in this area. In addition, you have the 406th Artillery Regiment and the 45th Artillery Brigade, and those two units are helping with the constant shelling of the Russian positions. So that is important to note. But the people living in Berislav, they haven't reported much noise in the area just yet. So it seems as if the situation is calm over there, but this is subject to change as time goes on. Let's look at the Andrivka bridgehead more closely as well, where you have the 36th Marine Brigade operating in this area. You have the 46th Air Assault Brigade, 35th Marine Brigade, 61st Infantry Brigade, and 63rd Mechanized Brigade. So all these units, they're being transferred in and out of the fighting depending on whatever losses they're suffering due to the Russian airstrikes. And the main coordination is around Berezh Nehuvate. In recent days, they've actually launched some pretty large assaults in the direction of Davydiv Brid. As of now, each one has been unsuccessful. On September 30th, they launched one with 14 vehicles, a lot of them being sent over from across the river, specifically from a pontoon bridge over here around Bila Krenitsia. And so 6 of those vehicles were destroyed, including 4 tanks. And so they tried again on October 1st, yesterday, and yet again the Russians were able to push them back from Davydiv Brid. This time about 20 vehicles were used by the Ukrainians, so they continue to try. They're not going to withdraw from this bridgehead, especially given the situation in northern Kherson where Ukraine is breaking through. But admittedly, this bridgehead has lost ground in recent days, and now the fighting is really centered around Suki Stavok. We have a video here of Ukrainian armor being hit right next to the town. So yes, they are suffering some pretty heavy losses here, given the fact that there is very little cover. The only real cover is around this forested area, and this is where you're seeing a lot of the battles going on right now between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. Let me highlight it over here. This is really where most of the fighting is going on between both sides, right outside of Bilohirka and Davidiv Breed. But again, I'm going to monitor the situation very closely, and whatever happens here, we'll talk about in the next video. Last thing before I move on is that there's a very important airfield called Chaplinka Airfield, which is pretty close to Crimea, and it's being used as sort of a hub of the Russian Air Force and a lot of ammo depots in here. So once Berislav or like the Ukrainians gain ground over here just south of Duchany, this would actually be within the range of Ukrainian shelling by HIMARS or some other MLRS system. Like you can see, it's only 56 miles away from the front line, so you could actually start seeing targets being hit from this area. And not only that, but you could see targets being hit even like Melitopol, because usually Melitopol is hit from Zaporizhia. Maybe now it could start being hit from the Kherson region as well. And of course, you have all these other towns around here that could be exposed as a result of this breakthrough. But let's move on now to the situation around Liman, where I did make some very significant changes to the map since the last time. I hope it looks nicer now, and I will obviously get rid of these blank positions over here. But let's get into what has changed since yesterday. So clearly the Zarabets River was not a sustainable line of defense for the Russians, because they quickly abandoned that and immediately retreated towards Kreminna itself. So had they stayed in Zarabets, the line would have looked like this right now, around this. But clearly they really did not have enough men, especially after suffering pretty heavy casualties in Liman. And whatever remnants of the groupings in Liman, whether they be BARS or the 20th Army, 58th Army, all of those units, they were moved through the highway from Liman to Kreminna, and they did suffer a lot of casualties due to shelling from the AFU as this occurred. And now they're really just centered around Kreminna, which means that Ukraine has control of Zarichny, Torske, Dibrova as well, this minor town over here called Mijmuny, Yampovlivka, Terny as well. Terny specifically, it was actually defended by I think it was the 208th Motor Regiment, and now they also retreated towards Kreminna, so you're seeing a lot of Russian withdrawals. It seems as if their new line of defense is specifically around the Svatove-Kreminna highway and also the Krasna River. So let me zoom in on that river for a second. The river is about over here. It is not wide at all. It could very easily be surmounted, so that's not much of a barrier. But it seems as if the Russians are entrenching themselves in this area. There are reports from BARS 13, which does still exist, although it suffered very heavy casualties in Liman. They're now in Kreminna, and they're talking about how they're setting up a lot of defensive positions, trenches in the forests just to the west of Kreminna, and that they're already being battered by Ukrainian artillery. Here we have a video of the BARS 13 unit shelling Ukrainian positions in turn. A lot of the Ukrainian shelling is coming from 155mm guns, so that's usually what they're using, but I'm sure they're also using M777s and Caesars. So yes, you do have some heavy artillery duels going on right now. Kreminna, in terms of its strategic advantage it gives Russia, is that it's a supply hub. It's connected to Rubizhny, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Svatove, and all of Lugansk in general. So it is very important for coordination. But it was way more important when Liman was still a part of Russia's control, and even more important when Izium was under Russian control, because that's how you'd really have supplies that would be sent to the front line. It would go through Kreminna, then Liman, then it would either be sent to the Donets River or to the fighting around Bohorodichny or to whatever fighting is going on just south of Izium. But now that all of this area has been taken by Ukraine, there's not really that much of importance left to Kreminna. That's the entire reason why it was taken in the first place, so it could be used as a supply hub. But now that they've lost it, what's the importance? I would say the importance is that it's a pretty good defensive line that should be held at all costs in order to prevent any sort of more towns falling to Ukraine in Lugansk itself. Because once Kreminna falls, there will be two areas that are very exposed to Ukrainian assaults. First of all, this entire area on Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Rubizhny will be heavily exposed because they can just go on this highway over here. They would have to occupy the suburbs first, and then they could actually reach Rubizhny, flank it from the north, and then actually pin the garrison in Severodonetsk around the river and quell it. And then all of these units that are west of the Donets River over here in Lysychansk and in all of the suburbs that were taken in the beginning of the summer, they would also be exposed. So you have a large grouping of Russian defenders in here that could potentially be isolated. And most of them are from O Group, I will say that. And then you could also see an assault going further north in the direction of Svatove. And Svatove, let's zoom in on it a little bit. It's about the same size as Liman, and it does have a lot of importance even now because of the logistics and the supplies that are centered around it. So it is important for the wider Kharkiv front and for the fighting going on around Kreminna. So the fall of this town would also lead to the collapse of another defensive line. So then what's the next defensive line? Well, there isn't one that is very coherent until we reach Starobilsk over here. And Starobilsk, it's around the Idar River. So it would be centered around Starobilsk and Novo Idar. But in order for this to happen, the Russians would have to cede so much territory that is not really viable politically, and it would just be a huge morale loss for the forces in there, and they would have to abandon so much heavy equipment in the retreat. So I don't see that happening. Basically, Russia's strategy at the moment is to hold out as long as possible in these larger cities, in these urban areas, until they absolutely cannot hold it anymore, when they're absolutely on the brink of encirclement, and then they withdraw, and they do that in the best manner possible. But of course, they have to suffer a lot of casualties in the process. It seems as if this is the best strategy that could be employed at the moment with limited reinforcements, but it does seem as if more reinforcements are being sent in as of now from the 20th Army, 58th Army, that are being sent in to reinforce the line around Kreminna, but only time will tell whether this is enough to actually prevent further breakthroughs, because right now, Ukraine, they have about 12,000 forces in this entire area, in this entire line around here that I'm drawing in red. They have about 12,000, and in terms of Russian numbers, we don't really have real concrete numbers, but it is safe to say that it is less than the Ukrainian numbers at the moment. So, in terms of units that are Ukrainian that are attacking in this region, we have the 105th Defense Brigade, the 4th Rapid Response Brigade, which was important in taking Liman. You have the 1st Special Purpose Battalion, which took Yampil. You have the 81st Air Mobile Brigade, which helped take Novoselivka, Shandry-Holove, Drobysheve, all those towns over there. And also the 79th Air Assault Brigade, which was important in fighting just south of Liman. And you also have the 103rd Defense Brigade, which I was pretty sure was centered around Seversk, but it was probably moved over across the Donets River. So, not only that, but you do have, of course, a lot of reinforcements that won't just be coming in from this Liman area, but also from Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, I'm sure also from Druskivka, Kostantinivka, Seversk, obviously, and even Soledar, because clearly the Russians are incapable of breaking through at Soledar, so the Ukrainians, they can afford to send some of their men that were stationed around Bakhmut and Soledar to continue to break through around Kreminna. And then obviously you have all the forces in around Izium and Kharkiv. So again, they, even with the heavy losses that they've suffered, and they have suffered very heavy losses and taken Liman, that is indisputable. They are able to offset this by sending in a lot of their reserves that were fighting in other areas that are now freed up. So that's another important thing to talk about. Now, in terms of the Russian defense garrison in Kreminna, we have obviously the Bars 13 and Bars 16 units, the 254th Regiment, which retreated from Terni. You have the 208th Motor Rifle Regiment. You have the 2nd Motorized Brigade, and you have the 752nd Motorized Regiment. So those are the main units in this area. You also have some LPR, DPR forces that are now going to be integrated into the Russian army, and I'm sure you're also going to get a lot of reinforcements from the Western Military District, which is the one which is really operating in this entire Kharkov region. The Central Military District is not in this area, but for whatever reason, Alexander Lapin, who is the head of the Central Military District, he was put in charge of the fighting around Kharkiv and then Liman. And so I noticed there was a lot of drama in between Ramzan Kadyrov and O Group about who's responsible for the defeat at Liman. So basically, the perspective of Kadyrov is that Alexander Lapin was responsible. He was basically sent in by the higher ups in the Russian command. So Gerasimov, Shoigu, those people, they handpicked him to be the guy to mount the defensive Liman, and they had a lot of trust in him because he was the guy who actually took over Lysychansk and Severodonetsk previously. But they moved him in, and what Kadyrov said is that he was not actually engaged with the actual battle. He was sitting in Lugansk. He was not actually actively participating, and he wasn't aware of what was going on the ground. He did not respond to requests for additional manpower and ammunition, and was not able to create a good communications and logistical situation. So as a result, that sort of led to the defeat. And so Kadyrov placed a lot of the blame on Lapin, and then he called out sort of subtly the higher ups for favoring him. But O Group sort of refuted what he said later on, and they said that Lapin, he was really doing the best in a difficult situation, and that he was shifted over from his central military district, which he's the leader of, to the western military district, so he didn't have that many men that he could really operate at the time. And the situation was just very difficult. There was a numerical disadvantage, and there weren't many reserves that could be sent in on time, and he was just trying to salvage whatever he could to prevent a total collapse and a total encirclement. And at least in that regard, he was sort of successful, but of course, it was a very ugly situation in general. So now you're seeing a lot of drama in between all sides of the Russian command. You have obviously the Chechens that are operating semi-independently from the Russian structure itself, and then the Wagnerites who are still operating in Bakhmut and in Spirny area, interestingly. And it's pretty weird because it would make more sense right now to stop the assault on Bakhmut temporarily and actually move them in to defend Kreminna, because it's not as if Ukraine is actually going to counterattack in Bakhmut at the moment. That is not possible, even if some troops were rotated, because Bakhmut is the one sector of the fighting where Russia actually does have a numerical advantage, and so it's pretty stupid to keep them all tied up in this useless part of the front line at the moment, especially when there's so much more going on around Kreminna. But this is really a part of Ukraine's strategy to tie up a lot of Russian forces in one area and then strike in another area. And that's the root of all those issues is the lack of manpower. So again, reinforcements are what is needed for the Russians at the moment if they want to continue this war going into 2023. But let's go over the final part of the front line, which is the Uskil front, where we do have some changes to the map. The 92nd Brigade, it was able to break through again over here, and they took Petropavlivka. They secured control of Kurilivka and of Novosinove. So basically, all these towns over here, and this was done in tandem with Ukrainian artillery crews, which were supplemented by drones, which got positions of Russian equipment. Sorry, and accurately struck those positions. You also had a lot of recon units operating in the forests that were ambushing the retreating Russian forces. So now basically their goal is to, one, reach Kislivka, which could happen in the coming days, given the fact that there's not much in between the Ukrainians and Kislivka, just one road. So the mechanized units could advance pretty quickly. And they also want to reach this other town over here called Orleanske, and this would be done in tandem with the 14th Brigade, which is operating around Dvorichny and Tavilzhanka. The Ukrainian assaults around Tavilzhanka have been failures up until now. This was reported by the Russians that the bridgehead is just very static right now, but it does seem as if the Ukrainians continue to transfer equipment to this area. They want to consolidate their gains over here before actually launching a new attack in the direction of Liman Pershi, and then further southeast they want to assist the 92nd Brigade with their attack on Orleansk. And again, this would help push the Russian line back towards Svatove. And so this is very interesting. There's one thing that I'm not sure about, and that is the status of Sinkivka. Some maps show it as under Ukrainian control, and some show it under Russian control. So it's probably under Ukrainian control by now, but I'm just not 100% sure. Either way, not looking good for Russia. And I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.